Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Lisa, to another webinar in the Association ARBITRI's ISDS webinar series. We are going to continue a conversation on the kind of substantive part of the investment law system and sustainable development and this transition that as a society we're currently undergoing. We have a wonderful guest today with us. I cannot think of anybody better to join the conversation and kind of share her thoughts on the topic of aligning international investment agreements with sustainable development. Before I introduce Lisa, for those of you who might not necessarily have had an opportunity to follow her work or meet her elsewhere, I would like to give you a bit of context and kind of set the scene for our conversation today. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, that the UN in 2015 adopted the 2030 agenda that kind of defines 17 sustainable development goals and accompanying 169 targets. And that agenda is a kind of culmination of the UN's work on sustainable development. So if you kind of dig a little bit deeper into the history and how the scope of the term and the framework of the term developed, you will kind of start at the Stockholm Conference in 1974, when the member states kind of recognized the need to address environment and environmental concerns. And that later on kind of brought this whole notion of balancing economic development with environmental concerns. And over time, through various milestones, that became what we know today to be sustainable development. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals reflect kind of the social, economic, and environmental aspects of sustainable development. And some scholars suggest that unlike what the UN put forward before, the benefit of an added value of the Sustainable Development Goals now is that they operate as a network of mutually connected and dependent goals and kind of lean on one another and depend in kind of realization and implementation on one another. What the UN 2030 agenda did explicitly, which is relevant for our conversation today, is that it not only recognized, of course, the role that states have as the primary stakeholder in adopting national policies and regulating in line with these goals, but it also defined that the private sector, irrespective of their size, geography, location, economic power, and so forth, has also bears a responsibility, also acts as a stakeholder, and that flexibility and innovation that private sector brings is actually a kind of an added value in their efforts and can have the potential of be very transformative in achieving sustainable development. And that includes not only kind of corporate governance and commercial relationships, but also investments, as the UN 2030 agenda recognized that the investments and investment law plays an important role in this context, of course, to attract and facilitate investments that are aligned with these goals. So on the side of the kind of very broadly speaking ISDS community, it's more or less accepted that these international investment agreements should align with sustainable development goals. Of course, the question is more in terms of how rather than why. And when you start exploring the possible ways of that alignment, you kind of almost open a Pandora box of issues, both in terms of legal implications, policy implications, and practical implications. So, like I said at the beginning, I cannot think of a better person than Lisa to talk with us today and kind of walk us through these issues. So, Lisa, welcome. And for our participants on the line, Lisa is a director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. Since joining the center in 2008, she established and now oversees a robust and interdisciplinary research portfolio and advisory work on the alignment of investment and investment policy with the Sustainable Development Goals. She teaches a master's seminar at Columbia Law School and Columbia School of International and Public Affairs on extractive industries and sustainable development, and lectures at Externado University in Colombia on international investment law. She has served on World Economic Forum Global Future Councils, on international governance, and on mining and metals, and is a co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network theme group on the good governance of extractive and land resources. She's a 2020-2021 Senior Fellow of NAFSA, Association of International Educators, and sits on several advisory boards, including of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights and SDG Academy. Before joining the center, she worked on the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility and at Amnesty USA, in both cases on shareholder engagement. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Harvard University and earned her Juris Doctor and a master's degree in International Affairs from Columbia University, where she was a James Kent Scholar and a recipient of the Parker School Certificate in International and Comparative Law. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today, Lisa.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure.
I'm quite excited about our conversation, so I think we can kind of start off the bat, and I'd like to kind of start us off and warm up the conversation a little bit and ask you that, you know, in your work and through the work of the center, you have advocated that there's a need for this new thinking concerning investment policy, focused on aligning investment policies and investment law with sustainable development goals. So to kind of further frame our conversation, could you maybe tell us what are some of the underpinnings that kind of justify that need for a shift? Some might call it a paradigm shift. So can you kind of walk us through what are the frameworks of that?
Yes, great, thank you, and thanks also for the introduction on sustainable development, which is a good starting point for all of us. The idea of sustainable development, which underpins all of my work and all of my thinking and that of much of the world, is that we are aiming globally for decent societies, improved human well-being, socially inclusive societies, and environmental sustainability. These are good foundational principles that, by the way, you gave a helpful history that the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in 2015 are essentially our most recent, or our generation's, attempt to enshrine and to achieve these foundational goals, but they're not new, as you indicated. I would say they go back even further. The first time I think that many of these ideas were enshrined is in the founding of the United Nations. And that was just the first time that they were agreed basically at an international level. But the ideas of improved human well-being and inclusive societies go back to the UN Declaration on Human Rights and through many successive treaties on biodiversity, on environmental protection, and so on. So the 2015 goals are, again, our most recent attempt to achieve these basic goals. And as you said, they were broken down into targets that should help guide all actors in society and all aspects of government in thinking through how to achieve these interrelated, as you noted, goals to achieve better societies. The idea is foundational and is important, but it has been very hard to achieve. We're not achieving the goals. We are facing extreme environmental crises that are largely the result of a rapidly growing economy and population on a finite planet. So we are facing crises of climate change, of unsustainable land use, of pollution, of pandemic diseases, which are secondary to changes in land use, and oops. An overarching one, is everything okay?
Everything is fine. My connection just broke for 1 second.
Oh, no,
Please do
okay.
continue.
Okay, great. And an overarching social crisis, I would say, that's important for us to think about in this context is one of social inequality across countries and within countries. And there are many, by the way, that inequality is widening over time. It's not narrowing despite these goals and decades of goals that attempt to address social inclusiveness. Part of the reason that inequality is growing is that technological advances inherently contribute to inequality because technological gains advantage skilled workers and capital owners, and they disadvantage the poorer in societies whose jobs are automated or who don't own capital and so can't accrue capital on capital and so on. So the way that our economy is structured and grows is contributing to the underlying inequality. How does investment play into this? And why, therefore, do I think so? All of our work is oriented around how governance can address these challenges. And it's twofold and it's foundational, which is why my whole career is oriented around the role of investment in addressing these sustainable development challenges. On one hand, investment can accelerate progress and toward these goals. So investment of all forms, domestic, foreign investment, all type public investment too, critically, can bring goods and services to the economy that help to address human well-being. They can accelerate investments in infrastructure. They can bring revenues to government that are necessary for other public investments and other public spending. They can create jobs, bring know-how and skills to an economy. So largely, governments recognize that investment can be a helpful, if not necessary, input to achieving sustainable development. And in particular, by the way, the sustainable development goals include certain transformations that will depend on more investment in renewable energy, and by the way, in investments in adaptation to help the planet adapt to a disastrously warming climate. But we also need investments in infrastructure, in healthcare. All sectors of society are going to need new types of investments, and governments recognize that and therefore want to attract investment. What's arguably a bit less central to the discussion is that not all investment contributes to those positive goals. And a lot of investment, even in positive sectors, can have harmful impacts on environmental outcomes, on certain aspects of social welfare, and so on. So investments can have harmful impacts, and some investments don't have the beneficial impacts. So much of whether and how investment helps to advance or whether it undermines our sustainable development goals depends on how that investment is structured, governed, shaped, and so on. And that is the opportunity and the role and responsibility of governments largely. Of course, it is also very much the responsibility of investors and of the private sector, but the activities of the private sector are decisively shaped by government policy that defines into which sectors investment comes, with which characteristics, in which geographies, and so on. What are the types of impacts that are encouraged? What are the types of investments that are encouraged? What types of impacts are encouraged? And which are prohibited because they are illegal, because they are discouraged, because they're at least not protected, and so on. Just to bring us to this discussion, at the moment, and the way that investment law, international investment law, has evolved for the past several decades, it's a relatively recent area of law, but it's roughly the past 5 decades in which we now have a chance to look back and see whether it's helping to achieve these goals. Arguably, the idea of international investment law is that an international governance framework for investment could and should help to accelerate the investments that will help contribute to growing economies. And the investment law system is built on the premise that investor protections will accelerate investment, and that investment will accelerate sustainable development. Those are two fundamentally flawed assumptions on which our whole investment regime has been built. The idea that investor protections are either the main constraint or the opposite, the main enabler of investment, has not been proven to be the case. So there is no evidence after 5 decades that investor protections are in any way accelerating investment flows. And then, of course, we know it not to be true that all investment is necessarily good and contributes to sustainable development. So we have more than 3,000 investment treaties that are by and large only investor protections, enforceable with investor state dispute settlement, arguably based on this premise that they will help to accelerate more investment and that investment will contribute to sustainable development, neither of which is true or being realized. So my purpose with our work and with our discussion is to reflect on that. And that should guide how we think about our approach to investment governance, our approach to investment, to the reforms of the regime, and to thinking about other tools and ways and priorities for governments to actually align investment with sustainable development. Is this working? Were our objectives of the system the right objectives to begin with? Are even those objectives being achieved? Are our current objectives being achieved? And if not, what does it look like to realign international investment governance with those objectives?
I mean, it's a powerful idea, like you said, a foundational idea, and I think it brings to the forefront much of the very needed kind of aspects of the conversation. You mentioned inequality, and I mean the overall discrepancies between the economic, diplomatic, political power, if you will, of the countries of the global north versus those of the global south has influenced the development of sustainable development and plays into the structures of FDIs as we know them. As we know them today. And I'd like to pick up on that later on in our conversation, but to stay with what you last said. So the first question, and this is kind of the part of the approach that the center and you yourself have been advocating for, is to align the international investment agreements with sustainable development goals to catalyze sustainable development friendly, if you will, investments. So how can that be done? So how can an international investment agreement catalyze, attract, and channel SDG advancing investments? And this in particular, given your last point that it's not clear and there isn't consistent evidence that international investment agreements attract or contribute to FDI flows to begin with. So when you put that in the context of SDGs, it kind of maybe reshapes the approach to the problem. And if you have any examples of where that has been done successfully, I think our audience would greatly benefit from that.
Yeah, great. So big, but the most foundational, fundamental question in this. A first step is for governments, and I would say this should be for individual governments to think about, is what are the objectives with respect to investment and sustainable development? I mean, actually, the first question is, what are a country's sustainable development goals? Where is a country most in need of additional inputs, whether public investment or private investment or so on, to close the gaps toward our goals? And of course, I mean, everybody on the call, everyone in the world should be familiar with these 17 sustainable development goals that cover a range of issues from, again, food, health, education, gender equality, jobs and security, climate safety, sustainable land use, sustainable waters and oceans, and so on. So the sustainable development goals cut across a huge number of environmental and social goals and objectives that, again, underpin decent, inclusive societies that will flourish, in which people have productive futures and so on. How do countries stack up against those goals? No country is doing perfectly. Some countries are doing much better. So the countries in Scandinavia, for instance, are probably the most advanced in achieving their sustainable development goals. Others have far to go to ensuring, for instance, that everyone in society has access to energy, period, or to clean energy in particular, or to healthcare, and that there is not a pervasive epidemic of food insecurity or of preventable diseases and so on. What are the challenges for individual countries? The second question is, how do we address those goals? Some of these investments necessarily are public, should be public investments if they are public goods for society and so on. Some should be public investments. And in some sectors, there's a need for international finance and international investment. So what are those areas? That should go, and then, once you identify where investment is needed, what are the constraints? Why is investment not being realized? Is it the terms of capital? Is it the terms of borrowing because countries have high sovereign risk ratings? Is it that bankable projects haven't been identified? Is it that the public sector needs to invest in corresponding public infrastructure or other public investments that will enable private investments to grow? Is it risk? Is it domestic political risk? What are the constraints? That should be the starting point for governments in thinking about their investment policy. Where do they want investment? What types of investments do they want to encourage? What types of investments do they not want to encourage? Or types of impacts have been negative on the country that they want to avoid? Countries have a massive toolkit of policy tools that can be used, many, if not most of them at the domestic level, to help shape these types of investments. There can be incentives, although those should be used carefully. There are different types of regulatory tools. Of course, there's the imperative of strengthening judicial systems and other institutional quality domestically and domestic infrastructure and so on. What can be done domestically to enable and to shape investment and how it contributes to these particularly identified goals and sectors and geographies and so on? And what can and should be done internationally? Where are international frameworks, commitments, protections, cooperation, and so on useful and better in some cases than what's possible at the domestic level? That should be the starting point to think about what investment agreements can and should look like. So we have put forward basically three ideas or three pillars of how to think about what it would look like for an investment agreement to align with what I've just laid out. The first is accelerating the types of investment that governments want and need, and discouraging or at least not protecting the types of investments that governments that are harmful or that are undermining countries' sustainable development goals. Just to contrast that with existing investment treaties, now investment treaties are completely agnostic on the type of investment. They generally, there's different language, but generally they protect a huge range of investors, investments, and so on, equity investments, shareholders, and so on in all sectors. They don't distinguish, and they're not specific in terms of the types of investments, the types of behaviors, the types of qualities, and so on that investors want to encourage, and those which they don't. Right now, they're overly inclusive. So our first pillar is that investment agreements should be tailored to accelerating the types of investments that governments want, and not protecting or not accelerating or discouraging investments that are harmful to countries' sustainable development goals. A second pillar relates to governance and supporting, if not emboldening, countries' abilities to govern that investment, to leverage that investment for its sustainable development objectives. As we earlier said, the outcomes from investment depend entirely on countries' abilities to regulate and to govern and to shape those investments. That might take any different form. Regulations that prohibit certain types of activities, the ability to use performance requirements and local content requirements so that you're building domestic industry and strengthening linkages, the ability to enforce domestic law, and so on. So governments' regulatory powers and ability are critical to achieving positive outcomes from investment. Treaties should strengthen that. If countries need stronger institutions and capabilities to properly regulate, that could be accomplished in the treaties. Right now, we have the opposite, which is that the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism in many ways undermines governments' ability to regulate, because governments' regulations, even enforcing domestic laws or regulating in the public interest, can be challenged through investor-state dispute settlement in ways that not only put a huge price tag on that regulation, but may discourage or chill the idea of regulation. So we can and should elaborate on that, but right now ISDS undermines government's policy space when what is needed is the exact opposite, strengthening government's ability to regulate in the public interest. And then our third pillar is that in a globalized economy, there are necessarily challenges that are international in nature, and therefore from a governance perspective, and therefore are difficult, if not impossible, for governments to address on their own. So issues of tax avoidance and tax evasion, climate change, international pollution, data privacy, antitrust issues. Some of these governance issues are transnational challenges. So investment treaties can, and frankly are one of the main mechanisms by which countries can collaborate and cooperate to address governance challenges of an international nature. So that's our pillar of what a treaty would look like, that it strategically and thoughtfully accelerates investment in key strategic areas and discourages investment in areas that undermine sustainable development goals, that they preserve and strengthen the ability of governments to regulate in the public interest, to benefit from that investment, because regulation is critical to benefiting from investment, and that they encourage or foster or enable international cooperation over areas of international governance challenges. You asked for examples of what this looks like. There are none, because existing treaties look completely different from this framework. They don't do any of this, really. By and large, the majority of treaties look substantially similar, although the differences in language matter. They matter in terms of arbitral interpretations and so on. So the differences matter, and there are some examples. I will give you one that look a little bit closer to this, but by and large, treaties are investor protection treaties. So they obligate governments to protect foreign investors. And like I said, a broad range of foreign investors and foreign investments. They enable investors to sue governments directly and to have their disputes heard by party-appointed private arbitrators outside of domestic systems and so on. And they don't address any of these sustainable development goals. To the extent that sustainable development is mentioned, it's sometimes in the preamble, which has no relevance, or it has not had any relevance for investors, nor have other aspects of international law and international commitments, which governments are also committed to: international human rights treaties, international environmental treaties, and so on. The one exception I would give that thinks about this a little bit differently is the Brazil treaties, which are different, actually. They're not investor protection agreements, they're investment facilitation and cooperation agreements. So they do think a bit differently about, and they were arrived at by asking domestic investors, what do you need? What are the constraints to investing abroad? And so they're really designed with that in mind. What can our investment partners do to enable and to accelerate investment from Brazilian companies in this particular case, or vice versa? They do not include investor-state dispute settlement. To the extent that there are disputes, they're resolved at a state-to-state level and by relevant state authorities. So they look different. They are cooperation and facilitation agreements. And I think that that's notable, by the way, because they were also arrived at by asking investors, what do you need? And it wasn't investor protections enforceable by ISDS. It was something quite different. But other than that, which is notable and worth paying attention to, there are not many treaties that have taken a step back to think about how they might holistically align with sustainable development objectives and policy needs.
Mm-hmm. I think Brazil is also an important example to give, because it's also a case study, if you will, that challenges the idea that a strong investment protection system in an international investment agreement helps and boosts the flow of FDI. So although Brazil took a different approach, and to my knowledge and from what I hear from you, yours as well, they're an exception rather than the rule, but Brazil didn't face kind of a drop in FDIs because of their different approach. It was quite the contrary. So it seems that although there are examples of that work in terms of having more of a management approach to FDIs, taking care of the investors before, during, and after their investment, and putting in different mechanisms of communication and management of that investment. Although there are examples of that working well in practice, still it hasn't been the norm. So I'm thinking now, what is the perception of these different states, especially if you consider that some states, because of kind of the discrepancy or in their economic development and their kind of global position, still maintain that if they have this system in place, they will still attract foreign investors, because the perception of the investors is such that if that is in place, they will come. If that is not in place, they won't. And they see that aspect more appropriate than a kind of overhaul of the whole system. So I'm not thinking what are some of the driving motives, if you could comment on that, that drive states in one direction or the other, and do they see any risks? I mean, not necessarily regulatory chill, but more, what kind of risks do they see if they suddenly take the approach that, you know, they're going to discourage harmful investments, quote unquote, and what risks do they see if they take the approach that they will not discourage harmful investments? I appreciate this is a lot of questions in one, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, it's less that it's a number of questions and more that it's so complicated, and I struggle really to really understand what is driving the continued expansion of the system. I have some theories, but I do find it a bit surprising. There have been decades of empirical analyses on whether existing treaties drive investment, and decades of research and meta-analyses of the analyses fail to demonstrate conclusively that investment treaties accelerate investment. The OECD put out a report in 2018, so did we, but I think the fact that the OECD did at the same time and with the same conclusions is notable, on the costs and benefits of investment treaties. The benefits arguably being that they accelerate investment. And the OECD confirms that those benefits are not proven. They're uncertain. That is, the whole premise of this system is that the treaties are either necessary or effective at mobilizing investment. And the evidence on that is inconclusive. And by the way, inconclusive evidence in the face of so many documented costs is not a great ratio. So what is happening, and why are states still, as you said, both adhering to the system or worried about what the consequences would be for, with adjusting to the system? And I'm trying to better understand that too. For sure, a big part of it is continued political and diplomatic pressure, and a very strong narrative that perpetuates the idea that you said, which is that there is still a narrative that these investment treaties are necessary to advance sustainable, or are necessary to advance investment, or that they're effective, or that I don't totally understand how that narrative stands up against the evidence, because it doesn't. But it is pervasive, and large capital exporting states perpetuate that narrative. International institutions that are advising states on their investment policy perpetuate that narrative that these investor protections are necessary. When you ask investors what they need and what their constraints are, the investors, the businesses, do not identify investor protections, certainly not in treaties and enforceable through ISDS, near the top of their constraints. And I will tell you a moment about a study that we're doing at the center now that I think will contribute to that understanding. But the investors don't say that. The lawyers do. The lawyers love the system. And there is a proliferation now of legal guidance to investors that says when you're going to invest somewhere, because you've already made that decision based on business factors and other factors, you should structure your investment to benefit from these international legal protections. So most businesses learn about these treaties and these investor protections from their lawyers, either when they are deciding how to structure an investment they have already decided to make, or when a dispute arises. But the power of the industry, of the international institutions, of the capital exporting countries, and perpetuating this sense, this narrative that these investor protections are necessary is important to understand and to grapple with. I would say, and I can understand how states in the face of that pressure worry about what the signaling consequences would be, or worse, of withdrawing from a system or changing, or of suggesting a different approach in the face of such a pervasive and powerful narrative. What I would suggest, and I think some states have started to do this, is that a public and robust analysis of whether a state's investment treaties have achieved their objectives, either their stated objectives or what the country's actual objectives currently are, aligned with their sustainable development goals, and say, states can and should say, of course, investment is a critical component of this, but the treaties as designed are not achieving that. They're not addressing what the main constraints are, and they're tying our hands in terms of our ability to govern. So we want investment, and we are going to look at the factors that actually underpin a stable, profitable environment for investment. So to my mind, states can continue to signal an openness and a commitment to investments and to the ability of investors to profitably invest in their country without perpetuating or committing to this model. And some states have started to do that. So there are states, South Africa and India and some South American states, who are critically reevaluating whether they are realizing the benefits, as compared to the mounting costs of the system. Those states have not seen a consequence of those assessments. So they are not experiencing a drop in investment as a result of this critical analysis, but it's slow. The questioning is slow. So I don't know if that answers your question, and I don't have great answers, but I think that I think we are facing a very powerful narrative. But I do think that states are even more powerful than that narrative, and can and should be able to say investment is critically important. We want investors to come. And so we're going to be thoughtful about what it takes to attract investors and to ensure that investors can operate profitably and stably in our countries. It doesn't look like these treaties, which actually have cost us more than they are benefiting.
Thank you very much for your thoughts. I find it very interesting always that it's the countries of the global south that are taking a more bold stand in terms of going through their investment agreements and thinking how they want to structure their investments going forward, to align them with sustainable development goals and not to take away from the need of having investments in various industries and so forth. What I also find interesting is that when you mentioned public participation, well, kind of having public participation and almost a democratic process in terms of how these how the strategies towards FDI flows and protections and conditions and management of that will happen. It's the civil society itself is putting an increasing pressure on the governments in terms of the speed and the extent of regulating in favor of sustainable development goals. And we're seeing that through climate change litigation across the globe against governments, various state and also non-state actors. So even if a government is not necessarily or was not necessarily willing to take a step further than what they have done before, the civil society through these litigations is going to push for that. Of course, the success rate is something that we can talk about, but just in kind of thinking the scope of that public participation, I find it quite interesting, because normally when you talk about the right to regulate and preserving rights to regulate for public needs, so health, environment, climate change, and so forth, normally the conversation goes towards, adjusting that with fair and equitable treatment and other standards of protection. But the right to regulate is no longer just in the state's discretionary power, if you will. There's also these factors that are kind of pushing the states of rethinking how they're going to regulate and in what aspect. So I don't know if you have any comments.
Yeah, I have three great thoughts, and I have a few responses. First of all, I do think it's important to note, you noted that it's often that it's the developing countries that are pushing this thinking. I just want to note that part of the dynamic is that developed countries, capital exporting countries, are coming to the conclusion now that they don't want investor-state dispute settlement as between themselves. They realize the harms that it causes. So intra-EU BITs are now terminated, and ISDS with respect to intra-EU investments is either off the table or on its way out. Of course, the interpretation of tribunals is not always in line with what the European courts are finding, but certainly within the EU, ISDS is on its way out. In the new NAFTA among Canada and the US, ISDS was eliminated. The US, even both the trade representative under Trump and Biden's administration, both don't favor ISDS. So the developed countries recognize the harms and that they don't need ISDS. They have not yet allowed that message to support developing countries or their investment partners to come to the same conclusion. Ostensibly because in treaties between capital exporting countries and capital importing countries, although they are bilateral, they are very much unilateral in that they overwhelmingly protect investors from and provide privileges. I wouldn't even say they protect, they are privileges, free privileges for investors from developed countries that don't benefit the developing countries, not only because they are not accelerating investment, but because there are so few investors from developing countries into those capital exporting countries that would benefit from the same privileges. So just to say, the spotlight seems to be on developing countries that are grappling with this, and you know, they're under a bit of the spotlight when they're rethinking this. But developed countries are coming to the same conclusion and eliminating it with respect to their own intra-developed country agreements. So I think that that's one notable point. The point on civil society and on how we think about regulatory space, I also find to be so interesting and important. Because, and this can bring us a bit to the discussion of current reform efforts. When we think about how to reform, when governments are thinking about how to reform, or even when some civil society groups that understand the investment regime think about what adjustments could and should be made within the investment regime, it continues to take as a given the general framework of investment agreements. So exactly to your point, when we think about regulatory space for governments, the question is not what tools do governments need and should they use and could they use to govern investment domestically and to ensure that investment, which is needed, is being distributed equitably, that environmental and social harms are being mitigated, that we are addressing investor needs and also community needs and so on. That's not the question. The question is, how can we shape this terminology in our agreements to clarify the basic point that governments have a right to regulate? So much of the focus has been on let's just take as a given that we're going to have treaties that constrain government's ability. How could we better phrase that to clarify? And I find that to be a funny starting point. Why is that our starting point? Why are we ignoring the fact that these treaties are not serving their benefits and just looking at how we might tweak? And by the way, also importantly, those tweaks have not been successful. And we could talk about why. But the quote unquote new generation of treaties, as they're called, which are treaties signed in the past 5 or so years, that do have more explicit police powers or right to regulate provisions or exceptions for measures that states take to regulate in the public interest. That's exactly the result of this civil society pressure, of these recognition of governments that their own right to regulate has been compromised by these agreements. So we've seen some of these adjustments. They have been largely overlooked or disregarded or dismissed by tribunals. Shockingly, in my view, we can have, and tribunals disregard them in all different ways. Some tribunals have said, sure, states have a right to regulate. No one says you can't regulate, but if you regulate and it impacts on investment, you pay overwhelmingly. Well, that's not really preserving a right to regulate. That's just saying you pay. If you do, sure, you can do whatever you want, but if you do this and it harms the investment, you pay. Or exceptions that say that nothing that states do to protect the environment, for instance, can be considered a breach of the agreement. Tribunals have had shocking interpretations of that, saying, well, in order for that to be applied, the investor has to have caused the underlying public interest issue. And when the government took the measure, it had to have been explicit that it was taking it because it was necessary to protect the public interest. And therefore, that exception doesn't apply. What? So just to your point, I think this conversation around right to regulate has been within the framing of how can we minimize the harms that we're seeing within the treaties. And even so, those modest reforms have not been successful to actually preserve government's right to regulate without having to compensate for the harms that that causes, as long as the regulations are, again, in the public interest, non-discriminatory, and so on, which so many of the challenged measures are.
I mean, when I think about the tweaks, as you said, and kind of the responses of the governments and the system to the system itself and its users, I always think about, you know, the reactive approach in terms of a problem occurs and now we're going to deal with this minor problem, but we're not going to think about this holistically. It just causes more leads to these problems kind of piling up, whereas a more proactive approach, such as the one of Brazil, and thinking about the system holistically and taking a proactive stance in dealing with these issues has showed, as we've discussed, to be quite successful. So just the conceptual approach to how we deal with these issues is a very much, you know, very much reactive. And I found the earlier comment that you made about the role of lawyers in investment, in structuring investment and kind of managing investors' need is so prevalent also in commercial contracts and just your basic business to business dealings, where the companies themselves see lawyers as this huge obstacle because of that reactive frame of thinking. You know, you're constantly thinking about a potential dispute that you want to safeguard yourself against. You're not thinking about how the law and the legal system can help that commercial activity or that investment activity to grow for the benefit of both sides. And I think that kind of goes to the root of some of these the examples that we're seeing in practice. And of course, just to kind of go back to your point on interpretation, I mean, there's this whole argument that, you know, it doesn't matter what you put in the treaty. If the states don't argue it, and then if you have tribunals, such as the tribunal in Ecuador, that simply, you know, take their own approach and just completely, almost completely disregard what is in the treaty. I mean, that decision has been, you know, shocking and has resulted in a lot of scrutiny. So it all comes down to, you know, which path you're going to choose. Are you going to choose the reactive approach and kind of tweak your agreements after Ecuador or further, or are you going to take a proactive approach and think about this in a different way?
Can I just respond to that very briefly?
Yes, of course.
I know that just two very quick things. One is I had flagged earlier, and so I just want to mention that one of the studies that we're doing at the center, which I'm really excited about, is that we all recognize that we need more investment in renewable energy, and the argument for that is very much intertwined in the now conversations around the modernization of the Energy Charter Treaty, for instance. We are taking that proactive approach that you just said, rather than saying how might the ECT, the Energy Charter Treaty, be tweaked to accommodate. We're looking at what are the actual drivers and constraints for investment in renewable energy. What are the factors that drive investment? What are the risks and constraints that investors face? We're doing that through desk research. We're doing that through surveys with investors and so on, so that we can take a proactive look. Okay, this is what would take to drive it. And these are the risks and constraints that investors face. Let's construct a framework around that. I will hypothesize, but I'm not driving the research, that treaties are not going to be at the top of that list. But let's look. I'm open-minded to it. We should really understand what the drivers are and what the constraints are. And the second point that I just wanted to make, oh my gosh, what was your second point? Shoot, I forgot.
It doesn't matter what you put in the treaty.
I know.
Tribunals. That was. I
can't remember that. I find that to be true, but I forgot my second point. But anyway, I'll let you continue.
I think that's just to your point on the approach in terms of the ECT. We had 2 webinars discussing the modernization of the ECT, and kind of we had Anya from the Climate Change Council discussing the inputs from their report as well. But the methodology in terms of kind of going to the investors and understanding what are the users' needs, for lack of a better word, and then seeing how the system itself can respond to those user needs and the society as a whole, is at the core of the proactive law theory and proactive law approach in general. So I very much look forward to seeing the results of that research.
I remembered my second point too, which is exactly
excellent.
What you just said, which is just on the role of lawyers. I just want to assure lawyers that there will always be a critical role for lawyers in regulation of investment. So I find the reactive nature, as you're saying, to be defensive of this system, defensive of, you know, the role for lawyers in resolving disputes. There will always be a need for lawyers in structuring good regulatory frameworks and structuring good contracts and in resolving disputes, by the way, because the disputes are not going anywhere. Where they're resolved and how and with what framing, that I would have strong views about. I think many of them should be resolved in domestic legal systems, and even domestic legal systems need support. But lawyers will have roles in dispute settlement, in dispute avoidance, in constructing good agreements. So I just want to say, I'm a lawyer too. This is not an anti-lawyer stance, but I do think that lawyers themselves could be more creative in thinking about, and not just creative, but also responsible in thinking about what the responsible and supportive role are for lawyers in constructing a legal framework, including a dispute settlement mechanism that is consistent with our sustainable development objectives.
I absolutely agree with you. I just think it's a think of reshaping, changing your approach to the task that you have as a lawyer. I'm a lawyer as well, and this is something that I'm hoping to kind of put in the minds of my students, that you don't have to be defensive. That's not what your primary role is, irrespective of where you end up, be it as an, you know, as an advisor to the government or just drafting contracts or whatever it is. But I think that that's kind of the overall perceptive that with advocacy might change in the future. I am mindful of the time of the webinar and of your time and your schedule. And I just want to kind of, we don't have an ending note. I would like to give you an opportunity to kind of wrap up our discussion with some concluding remarks. But just the number of topics that we have opened up and that are left open just showcases how complex the issues are, and that we are still in the stage of developing solutions and finding appropriate answers. And I feel that a lot of discussions of this sort go to that, to open a question and then try to kind of unpack it to find some path towards a solution, which is something that we have been trying to do for the last hour. But nonetheless, before I wrap up the webinar, I'd love to hear what are your thoughts for concluding our discussion.
Thank you so much. It's been a really fun discussion. As you said, time passes so quickly. I think my concluding remarks is that that keeping our objectives at the core of what we do and how we work, I think will be a very valuable driver in how we engage in these discussions in the system in our own respective roles. And that when we lose sight of the objectives is when these discussions go a bit awry. So I urge all of us to keep the objectives, which I think the Sustainable Development Goals are wonderful, globally agreed goals to keep as our objective, to have decent, healthy, sustainable societies in a planet that will be around for our kids and grandkids and so on. And how do we construct, how do we achieve that in our respective avenues? I think, and then I guess the last point I would just make is that everyone in this system has power to shape the outcomes. I think developing countries too often underestimate their powers relative to their negotiating partners or in the context of multilateral fora. I really strongly disagree with that. I think every country has an incredibly powerful voice and will be listened to. And I want to offer that we at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment and a number of our international partners are available to support those reflections and those positions. Sometimes finding international allies to bolster, to support the research and the thinking can help in this. So there are allies out there to think through that. And everyone in the system, the institutions, the lawyers, everyone will have a good role in a sustainable system that emerges. But let's think together around what that looks like, starting from the point of the societies that we want to achieve.
Thank you very much. And I feel that your concluding comments are especially relevant for countries such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is kind of currently part of the UNTITLED Working Group 3, and is now facing these challenges of how to align its overall economy and attract foreign investments with the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're just one among many countries that of course are facing these, and knowing that there is support out there, I think is valuable for our legal and our business community and our government officials. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for taking the time. It was such a pleasure to have you on this webinar, and I hope that this will not be the last time that we will have you as our guest on the series and in our project. But for this time, it was such a pleasure. I enjoyed the discussion very much, and I look forward to our next collaboration. Thank you so much. So do I, very much. And to our participants, thank you for joining. The recording will be available will be available to our participants, and stay tuned for the announcements of the next webinar in the ISDS webinar series. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a lovely weekend. Bye. Thanks very much.